The year was 1865, a time when the wild frontier seemed to stretch forever, untamed and unforgiving. The wind had begun to howl with a bite sharper than a rattlesnake's strike, and the snow, heavy and relentless, fell in thick, suffocating sheets. It was a time when a man could disappear into the wilderness and never be heard from again, when survival meant something more than living. It meant bending the land to your will or dying trying. Jessie McAllister had long since learned the ways of the mountain, how to track the deer by the sound of their hooves in the deep snow, how to tell when the weather was changing by the chill and the wind. At 22, she had seen more hardship than most could imagine, but none of it had ever broken her. Raised in the shadow of the towering peaks, her life had been one of solitude and quiet, far from the bustling towns below. But even in this isolation, she had heard the whispers, the rumors of men, armies, and the fires of conflict that were sweeping through the land. It was one of those nights when the storm came down harder than it had in weeks. The wind roared like a beast, clawing at the logs of her cabin, while the fire crackled in the hearth, throwing flickering shadows against the walls. Jessie had been out earlier in the day, gathering what little firewood she could find, but now, as the storm raged outside, she found herself pacing the cabin, restless. She had always preferred the company of the wild to the people below. There was no judgment in the trees, no gossip among the rocks. Her father had taught her to be strong, to rely on herself, and the mountain had always answered her call. But tonight, something felt different. The storm felt colder than usual, more biting. Her senses were sharp, attuned to the subtle changes in the air, as though the very world around her was holding its breath. That was when she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible above the roar of the wind. At first, she thought it was a trick of the storm, a branch snapping perhaps. But then it came again, unmistakable now, the soft groan of a man's voice, muffled and weak. Jessie's heart skipped in her chest. She was alone here, miles from the nearest neighbor, and anyone out in these mountains would be desperate, either lost or fleeing from something. There was no time to waste, no room for hesitation. She grabbed her rifle and her coat, then hurried out into the howling storm. The snow was already deep, nearly up to her knees as she slogged through the drifts, the wind whipping at her face, stinging her skin. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps, and the world seemed to narrow to just the next step, the next breath. The voice came again, softer now, and she followed it, her feet sure despite the storm. Then, through the veil of snow, she saw him. He lay sprawled on the ground, half frozen, his skin a deathly shade of pale against the white snow. His clothes, once fine but now torn and dirted, were stiff with ice. His hair, dark and tangled, lay in matted strands over his face. He looked barely conscious, his breath shallow and ragged, like a man clinging to the last thread of life. A gun belt was strapped to his waist, a rifle near his hand. No ordinary man, that was certain. But who was he? What had brought him so far into the mountains, and why did he look so out of place? For a moment, Jessie hesitated. There was something about the man that made her gut twist in warning. His stillness seemed unnatural, as though he wasn't just frozen by the cold. And yet, there was no time to consider what he might be or why he was here. He needed help, and help was the one thing Jessie could give. With a quick glance around, she knelt beside him, careful not to disturb him too violently. She could feel the cold radiating from his body, and it made her heart race. He was a stranger, possibly dangerous, but she wasn't about to let him die out here alone. He groaned as she lifted his shoulders, trying to pull him toward her. His body felt heavy, like stone, stiff with frost. But there was muscle under his clothes, and the raw strength of him made her pause for a moment. Who was this man? What had he done to end up in such a state? She managed to get him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as she led him toward the cabin. The storm continued to lash at them, the snow now blinding her. But she kept her focus on the task at hand. His face was now exposed, and Jessie could see that he wasn't just any man. He was a warrior, his features sharp and proud, even in his weakened state. His high cheekbones, the broad forehead, and the dark eyes that peered out from under the tangled mass of hair told her this much. He was of a different people. But which? She couldn't tell. The wind was so fierce now that it made every step a battle. But she pushed on, her resolve as firm as the mountain she called home. With one last effort, she pulled the stranger through the door of the cabin, closing it behind them with a sense of finality. Inside, the warmth of the fire hit her like a wave, but it was little comfort. The man was in bad shape. She lowered him to the floor and knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she worked quickly to strip away his wet clothes, her heart hammering in her chest. His skin was cold to the touch, his body trembling, but his breath came faster now. She didn't waste time with questions. She just worked, pulling blankets from the bed and wrapping him in them, trying to warm him to keep him from slipping away. But even as she tended to him, she couldn't help but feel a strange pull in her chest, a curiosity that gnawed at her. Who was he? Why had he come so far into the mountains? And why did he seem so different from the men she had known? There was something in the way he carried himself, even now, as if he were more than just a wounded stranger. Something about him felt powerful, dangerous, maybe, but it was a feeling she couldn't place. As she worked, she noticed the dark red stain on the sleeve of his shirt, a stain that hadn't been caused by the cold. He had been hurt before he froze, maybe even in a fight. But who would dare come out here and fight with someone like this? A part of her wanted to ask him, to demand answers, but she didn't have the courage. Not yet. Not when his life hung in the balance. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the man stirred. His eyes opened, slow and unfocused, and Jessie's breath caught in her throat. He blinked, his gaze shifting to her, and for a moment, there was something in his expression, something wild, confused, and uncertain. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice deep, gravelly, a strange cadence to it. Jessie swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "You were freezing. I couldn't leave you out there." He nodded slowly, though his confusion seemed to deepen. "I am not the man you think," he murmured, his voice fading with each word. She leaned closer. "Who are you?" He didn't answer, his eyes fluttering closed again as if he were fighting against the weight of sleep, the cold, and whatever else had brought him to her doorstep. But as she sat back, watching him, the fire crackling softly in the background, a single thought gnawed at the back of her mind. There was more to this man than he was letting on. And soon, she would learn just how much. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the small cabin. Jessie McAllister sat across from the stranger, her hands busy with the mundane task of sewing a tear in her jacket. But her mind wasn't on the task at hand. Her thoughts kept drifting to the man in front of her, the stranger she had found frozen in the snowstorm, the one she had saved from certain death. He lay on the small cot by the fire, wrapped in the thick woolen blankets she had hurriedly thrown over him. His breathing had evened out, and though he still looked pale, the flush of warmth was slowly returning to his skin. His high cheekbones, dark eyes, and sharp features kept calling to her, telling her that he was no ordinary man. His clothes were too fine, his posture too commanding for him to be a simple traveler. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far more dangerous behind his eyes. Jessie had never been one to pry into the business of others, but something about this man gnawed at her, stirring a curiosity that felt foreign. She needed answers, and yet, when she tried to speak with him, all he would offer were vague answers, quiet grunts, or cryptic mutterings that only deepened the mystery. She had thought, initially, that she might give him time to recover before pushing him for more. But now, as the hours passed and he remained largely unresponsive, she couldn't sit idly by any longer. Her patience, typically boundless, had its limits. With a sharp breath, Jessie set down her sewing and stood, moving toward the cot. Her boots scraped softly against the wooden floorboards, the only sound breaking the stillness in the room. She stopped at the side of his cot and stared down at him, her gaze lingering on the way his brow furrowed, even in sleep. He had not yet spoken much, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something in the way he held his silence, that made her feel as though he was used to being in control, used to holding power. The man shifted slightly, groaning as his eyes fluttered open, the thick lashes brushing against his tan skin. His gaze met hers, dark and unreadable, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jessie's fingers tightened around the edge of the cot, resisting the urge to demand answers. She had no reason to rush, no reason to press him, but something deep inside her told her that the truth of who this man was, and what he had been through, could not remain buried for long. "Where did you come from?" Jessie asked softly, breaking the silence, her voice a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The stranger didn't answer right away. He turned his head slightly, staring into the flickering flames, his jaw clenched tight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, hoarse, as if it had been a long time since he had used it. "I came from the north," he said, his eyes still locked on the fire. "A place you wouldn't know." Jessie frowned, stepping closer, her boots softly tapping against the floor. "The north? That's a long way from here." His lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't acknowledge her comment. He simply closed his eyes again, and for a moment, Jessie thought he might fall back to sleep. But then his gaze snapped back to her, sharp and piercing. "Why do you want to know?" he asked, his voice suddenly hard or guarded. "I'm just a man who was lost, and now I'm not." Jessie met his gaze, unwavering. She had heard that tone before, too many times in the wilderness, from men who had something to hide. Something in her chest tightened. "I saved your life," she said, her voice firm. "I think they give me the right to know." The man's lips twitched, the faintest trace of a smile. Or was it a grimace crossing his face? He stared at her for a long, silent moment before he sat up in the cot, his movements slow, as though his body had not yet fully adjusted to the warmth. "All right," he said, the words reluctant. "The truth is, I wasn't supposed to be out here. Not like this. I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near these mountains. But here I am, and you're right. I owe you." Jessie's heartbeat quickened as she took a step closer, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Oh, me? You don't even know my name." He hesitated, his gaze flicking to the fire again before meeting her eyes once more. "No, I don't. But I know what you've done. I know what you've risked." He leaned back slightly, the wood of the cot creaking under his weight. "The question is, what do you risk by helping a stranger like me?" Jessie's mind whirled. Risk? She was no stranger to risk. But this man, there was something about him that unsettled her, something that felt dangerous in a way she couldn't put into words. She wasn't afraid of the wild, not in the way others were. But this was different. "What is it you're running from?" she asked, her voice low and steady. The man's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Jessie saw the flicker of emotion in his dark eyes, something like regret, or perhaps guilt. But it passed quickly, replaced by the stoic mask he wore so well. "Not running," he muttered. "Surviving." Jessie's eyes never left him, sensing that there was far more to the story than he was letting on. "You don't have to hide the truth from me. I'm not here to judge you." For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, with a deep, heavy sigh, he finally spoke. "I own the Riverboats," he said, his voice steady but laced with bitterness. "I own the rails. Everything that runs through this land. It's mine." Jessie blinked, stunned by the unexpected revelation. "The riverboats? The railroads?" He nodded once, his face expressionless. "Yes, I'm not the man you think I am. But you already knew that." Jessie swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in the pit of her stomach. The name she had heard in passing, the rumors of a ruthless, powerful man who owned everything in these parts. Was this him? Was this the same man? She hadn't believed it when she'd heard the stories in the nearby town. But now, standing before her, he was real, flesh and blood, and he was no stranger. He seemed to sense her shock, but his eyes were calm, almost too calm. "It's all true, but there's more you need to know. I've got enemies, powerful ones, and they've found me." Jessie couldn't help but feel a chill run through her. "So, you're hiding from them? In these mountains?" He nodded once more, his expression unreadable. "I had no choice. They came for me. They tried to take it all." His voice dropped to a murmur, and for the first time, he seemed vulnerable. "I was supposed to die out there in the snow." Jessie stood silently, the weight of his words settling into her chest like a heavy stone. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was brewing in this man's life. But now, as she stood in front of him, his fate was tied to hers, whether she liked it or not. She took a breath, the tension thick between them. "Then you'll have to trust me," she said quietly. "Because if they're after you, they'll come for me, too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled outside, but in the warmth of the cabin, there was silence, an uneasy silence, as though the weight of the world had just shifted onto Jessie's shoulders. The sun had barely risen, its light pale and distant, filtering through the narrow gap in the cabin shutters. Jessie's breath came in quiet puffs as she moved about her small kitchen, preparing breakfast. The scent of bacon sizzling in the skillet mingled with the cool morning air that slipped in through the cracks. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural for the wilderness. Everything outside was still, frozen in the wake of nature's fury. The stranger, the man whose name she still didn't know, had barely stirred from his place by the fire. Jessie glanced over at him, her brow furrowed. He had been awake for a short while now, but he hadn't said much since their exchange the evening before. His expression, when he had spoken of his past, had been guarded, his words sharp as though he was ready to shut down the conversation at any moment. But Jessie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to him than he let on. A sudden sound from the bed caught her attention, the faint creak of the cot under shifting weight. She turned, catching sight of the man's profile, his dark eyes now fully open and staring toward the fire. His jaw tightened as he rubbed the back of his neck with a hand that appeared strong but slightly unsteady. He was clearly still recovering from the cold, his body stiff from the frostbite and exhaustion. "You should eat something," Jessie said, her voice gentle but firm. "It'll help you heal faster." He didn't answer immediately, but she could see the tension in his posture. Slowly, he sat up, wincing as he did. His broad shoulders were stiff, and he looked as though every movement cost him something. When his eyes met hers, there was something else in them, something beneath the layers of indifference he had wrapped himself in. For a moment, there was a flicker of gratitude, quickly buried by the same guarded expression that had become his constant mask. "You've done enough already," he muttered, his voice rough. "I'm not used to needing help." Jessie's lips tightened, but she didn't respond to his self-sufficiency. She had seen this before in men who had been through too much, the stubbornness that came with pride and pain. Instead, she simply set a plate in front of him, the bacon and eggs hot and fragrant. He stared at it for a long moment, as though weighing the effort it would take to eat, before slowly picking up his fork. The silence between them was heavy, yet not uncomfortable. The cabin, small as it was, felt both isolating and intimate, as if the world outside had forgotten them, leaving them alone to deal with whatever it was that had brought this strange man into her life. "You don't talk much," Jessie ventured after a while, her eyes fixed on the flames in the hearth. "Not since last night." He swallowed his food before answering, his voice measured and cool. "There's not much to say." Jessie raised an eyebrow, setting down the skillet and wiping her hands on a rag. "I don't buy that," she said, her tone light but piercing. "You're not the kind to keep your mouth shut unless you're hiding something." He met her gaze, his lips curling into something that might have been a smile, sharp and fleeting. "I'm not hiding anything," he said. "I just don't see the point in sharing things that don't matter." His words landed like a cold stone between them, but Jessie wasn't deterred. She knew better than most the value of silence. But this wasn't just any stranger she had taken in. This man had the look of someone with a past, something that could either make him an ally or an enemy, depending on how it played out. "Well, if you say so," she replied, her voice a touch softer now. "But if you're planning to stay here, I'd suggest you share a bit more than that." He didn't respond immediately, but after a long pause, he let out a low sigh. "I wasn't planning on staying," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "But plans change." Jessie's heart skipped a beat. She had known it wasn't going to be that simple. She had known that the minute the storm had passed and the snow had cleared, he would be gone. He was a man who clearly didn't like staying in one place for too long. But what bothered her wasn't his desire to leave. It was the weight behind his words, as though his stay here, even if only temporary, had a deeper consequence. "What kind of plans?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the curiosity gnawing at her. His gaze turned back toward the fire, and for a long moment he didn't answer. Jessie could see the wariness in his eyes, the way his body seemed to tense as though even the thought of speaking about his past was an unbearable burden. And yet, as the seconds passed, Jessie sensed a shift, a subtle change in his demeanor. Perhaps, he thought, he had no other choice but to answer her. Perhaps this was the point of no return. "I own the riverboats," he said again, his voice almost as if testing the weight of the words. "And the railroads. Everything that passes through this land. You probably don't realize what that means. But I'm not just some businessman. I've been marked." Jessie's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't interrupt him. She merely waited, her eyes trained on him, every muscle tense with the realization that she was finally getting a glimpse into his world, a world she had never dared to enter. "I was born into this," he continued, his voice harder now, the words coming faster. "My family owned it all, but it wasn't enough for them. They wanted more. They took what they could and left me with a mess. There are people out there who want what I have left, and they'll stop at nothing to take it, to kill me if necessary." His words hung in the air, the heaviness of them settling over Jessie like a blanket she couldn't shake off. She had heard stories of men like him, the ones who built empires on the backs of others, who played games with lives as if they were nothing more than pawns. But the way he spoke, the way his eyes clouded over with regret, told her there was more to this story than greed. There was fear, and there was something else, too, a glimmer of pain that ran deep. "I didn't ask for this," he said softly, his voice tinged with something darker. "But I'll do whatever it takes to keep it, to survive." Jessie watched him closely, her heart tightening as she took in the weight of his words. She had expected answers, but she had not expected this. A confession, raw and vulnerable, something that none of the men who came through her life ever offered. And yet, there was no relief in his eyes, no redemption. Only a resignation that cut deeper than any scar. "Well," Jessie said, breaking the tension with a breath, "you've made yourself clear." He didn't reply. Instead, his gaze flicked to the door, as though the mention of his enemies had triggered something else in him, an urge to leave, to run. Jessie could see the conflict warring inside him, the urge to escape warring with the reality that he couldn't run from this forever. And just like that, it was clear. He wasn't just a stranger now. He was tied to her in ways that couldn't be undone, whether they liked it or not. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly, meeting his eyes. "You're not running anymore, and neither am I." For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, something like recognition. Maybe it was a shared understanding, maybe it was resignation, but whatever it was, it broke the last of the wall between them. And so, there they were, two souls, caught in a world neither of them could escape. The wind had shifted, and Jessie could feel it in the air, a chill running up her spine as she stepped outside the cabin. The sky had darkened quickly, the clouds rolling in like an army marching toward them, promising trouble. It was a quiet storm, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, but this time it wasn't the weather she was worried about. It had been 2 days since the stranger, now known only as James, had confided in her. He was right. He hadn't been running from some nameless enemy. The truth was far more dangerous, more complicated than she could have imagined. He had made enemies of men who had no mercy, men who had hunted him for years. And now, they were closer than ever. Jessie had done what she could to help him recover. She had fed him, tended to his injuries, and offered him space to breathe, but the clock was ticking. She could feel it in her bones, the kind of pressure that came when you were trapped and the walls were closing in. And they were closing in fast. "Is it time?" Jessie asked, standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on James, who had been pacing for hours now. He didn't look at her immediately. His gaze was trained on the snow-covered land outside the cabin, his silhouette a dark, rigid figure against the pale landscape. The fire crackled in the corner of the room, but it did little to warm the atmosphere between them. "Not yet," he replied, his voice low and distant. "But soon." Too soon. She stepped toward him, her boots crunching on the wooden floor, the only sound in the otherwise silent cabin. "They're out there, aren't they?" He nodded slowly, but still, his eyes never left the horizon. "They've been tracking me for months. They'll come for me here, and they won't stop until they have what they want." Jessie felt the weight of his words like a stone dropped in her gut. There was no escaping this. No hiding. His enemies, powerful men with vast resources, had cornered him. It was only a matter of time before they found him, before they found them. "I'm not letting you face them alone," Jessie said, her voice firm, though her hands were shaking slightly. She'd never been one for violence, for confrontation. But the truth was, she didn't care about her own safety anymore. Not if it meant letting this man, this stranger who had become something more, face what was coming alone. James finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. His dark eyes flicked over her, lingering for a moment before he spoke. "You don't know what they're capable of," he said, his voice quieter now, tinged with something that wasn't quite fear, but was close enough to it. "These men, they don't play by any rules." Jessie squared her shoulders, the muscles in her neck tight with the kind of resolve that came when you knew there was no turning back. "I've lived in this land long enough to know that sometimes you don't get to choose who walks into your life, but you can choose who you stand beside." For the first time in days, James seemed to soften. His lips parted as though he might say something, but he didn't. He only nodded once, his gaze flicking to the door. "You're right," he said, his voice heavier now, almost resigned. "And if they're coming, I'm not running anymore. It ends here." The storm outside began to pick up, the wind howling as it whipped against the cabin. Jessie could hear the sharp whistling of the snowflakes as they rattled against the windows, a prelude to the chaos that was about to unfold. She moved toward the corner where she kept the rifle, her fingers brushing over the worn wood of the stock. Her father had given it to her when she was a girl, teaching her how to shoot, how to survive. "Take your position," she said to James, her voice steady, unwavering. "If they're coming, we need to be ready." James gave a sharp nod, and without another word, he moved to the window, peering through the shutters. Jessie could see the muscles in his back tense as he surveyed the land, his body coiled like a spring. He was ready. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them thick and charged. Then, the sound came, a distant rumble, the unmistakable echo of hooves pounding through the snow. "They're here," James muttered, his voice a low growl. Jessie's heart pounded in her chest as she took her position behind the cabin, peeking out from the corner. She could see the riders now, moving fast, their shadows stretching across the snow as they drew closer. There were 5 of them, all dressed in heavy furs, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. But the way they rode, the way they moved, told her everything she needed to know. These weren't ordinary men. They were hunters, predators. "Stay low," James whispered, his hand on his holster. "We take them one by one." Jessie nodded, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur of strategy, fear, and a lingering feeling that this was the moment that would change everything. The riders drew closer, their hooves crunching through the snow. Jessie's fingers tightened on the rifle, her knuckles white as she steadied her aim. She could hear James's breath beside her, slow and deliberate, matching the rhythm of her own. And then, just as the first rider broke from the group, Jessie fired. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, the sound splitting the air, and the first rider was knocked from his horse, his body slamming to the ground with a sickening thud. The other riders jerked in surprise, but they didn't hesitate. They spurred their horses forward, their guns drawn. Jessie moved quickly, ducking behind a large rock and firing another shot, her hands steady despite the chaos. She hit another rider, sending him tumbling from his saddle. But the remaining 3 were closing in fast, their weapons trained on her position. James fired next, his shot true, and one of the riders crumpled to the ground. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining 2 were almost upon them now. Jessie's heart raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. She moved with precision, taking cover and firing when she could, but she knew the truth. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a reckoning, a final showdown, and she was ready. The second-to-last rider charged, his face twisted in rage, his rifle raised. But before he could get a shot off, James was on him. The man barely had time to react before James's fist slammed into his face, sending him reeling backward. He fell to the ground, unconscious, before he even had a chance to draw his gun. The final rider, seeing his comrades falling one by one, hesitated. His eyes flicked between Jessie and James, his fear evident. He was fast, but not fast enough. James drew his pistol, his movement quick and fluid, and fired once, twice, the shots ringing through the air. The last man dropped without a sound. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when everything is still, when the echoes of what just happened linger in the air. Jessie's breath came in ragged gasps, her body tense as she lowered her rifle, her heart pounding in her chest. James stood beside her, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his face grim but resolute. The snow around them was stained with red, but there was no time to linger on it. "We're not done yet," James said, his voice cold and low. "More will come. They always do." Jessie nodded, her jaw clenched. She didn't need him to tell her that. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, the truth that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But for now, in this moment, she had stood beside him. And they had won. The reckoning had come. And they had survived. But what cost? As they turned toward the cabin, their backs to the carnage in the snow, Jessie knew they couldn't outrun what was coming next. They were bound together now, by blood, by fate, and by the fire that had only just begun to burn.